Today, we've gathered a panel of experts to take a close look at what really works to drive adoption of more sustainable models in transportation, where pressure to make electrification a widespread reality is coming from today, and where it might come from in the future. It's always a critical moment for climate change, whether it makes headlines or not. And the panelists we'll hear from today know that better than most. So since urgency is what's needed in this discussion, let's meet them all right now. Aditya, Director of EV Marketing and Sales for Nissan, is in charge of how Nissan needs to change in the electric age. Aditya, in just a few seconds, what's your top priority this year?
My top priority this year is to make sure that the entire ecosystem is further prepared for this big change that is coming upon us. The change is already here. So making sure all the different stakeholders, internally and externally, are prepared to embrace this change is the number one priority.
Fantastic. We also have with us Alyssa Mudo, Director of Sustainability and Mobility for the City of San Diego. Alyssa, same question. What's at the very top of your to-do list right now?
Oh, thank you, Emma. For the City of San Diego, the top of our mind is our update to our climate action plan, really focusing and centering around equity and further reducing our greenhouse gas emissions as a city, where we can walk the walk and step out there and be part of the solution in the effects of climate change and resiliency.
Great, thank you for that. And finally, we have Alvaro Sanchez, VP of Policy at the Green Lining Institute, which seeks to harness vehicle electrification to address historic inequality. Alvaro, in just a few sentences, could you share a bit more detail about this mission for those who may not see an obvious link between electrification and equity?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me. Well, the link is that, we're going through a revolution in our transportation sector, and we have to do it urgently because of climate change. But as we've seen through the development of our cities, our transportation infrastructure, many times, particularly here in the US, communities of color have been left behind, and those communities have been locked in with poverty and pollution. So as we move forward and we are bringing in a more sustainable, cleaner form of mobility, we want to make sure that we don't repeat those mistakes of the past, and that we take this opportunity to address systemic issues that our communities have been facing, and vehicle electrification and mobility are a perfect way to be able to introduce that into these neighborhoods.
Wonderful. Okay, hold that thought, Alvaro, because I'm coming to you again next. Let's set the table for this discussion. We're going to talk about the future, but from each of your diverse perspectives right now, where are we in terms of progress toward the kind of shift we need in the transportation sector to meaningfully impact global temperature rise and equity? Alvaro, why don't you go first?
I would say we're at the very early stages of our path towards cleaner, more sustainable, more equitable communities. And unfortunately, we have to speed up really quickly, but we have to do that very intentionally so that we don't replicate the mistakes of the past. Where we're at right now is that our communities that are most polluted are also the ones that suffer from the most amount of poverty. And these are the places also that have the least amount of political capital and financial capital to be able to make a transition towards a healthier environment. And as we're seeing now with Hurricane Ida, with wildfires, these are the same places that are most vulnerable to climate change. So we have to speed up everything: our adoption of electric vehicles, our policy, our citizen mobilization to demand that these things happen in our communities. And we're just getting started. California is further ahead than most of the country. The federal government is quickly catching up, and I'm excited to hear what they have planned, but we need to do so much more. And that's just here in the United States. Globally, we're even further behind, unfortunately. But some good things are coming out of California and other states that are taking on this fight.
Gotcha. Well, we've got the right person to tell us about a little bit of California. So Alyssa, could you set the table for us as well? Where are we right now in this journey?
Well, so I think it's about, when we look at our mobility, our mobile source emissions, those comprise for cities over half of the emissions that we have that we need to reduce to get to zero. And first and foremost, focusing on how we can create mobility options and increase choices for our residents. So for those who want to and need to take transit and bike and walk, making those safe and convenient options. But for those that need their cars, whether they have a family that they need to be able to move around the city or they have a service job, those cars need to move to an electrification. So how do we as a city support electrification for all of our residents? And as we see incentive-based programs at the state and federal level for increasing ownership, the charging component is going to be really critical. And that's a critical path for our city right now.
This is great. You guys keep setting each other up. Aditya, Nissan's been at this for a minute. Can you tell us where you see Nissan and the sort of broader ecosystem in terms of status toward electrical transportation?
Sure, absolutely. So you said it right. Nissan's been at this for a while. So we introduced the first mass market electric vehicle, the Leaf, in 2010 with over 100 miles of range. So we know we have some history. We know what customers are looking for, and we're building towards this. So if we just look at what's happening in the industry today, EVs are about 3 to 4% of the total industry. I'm talking about new car sales, 3 to 4%, right? That is tiny. That's really small. And based on forecasts, in about 9 years from now, 2030, that number will go anywhere between 40 to 50%, right? So what we're saying is, today, give or take, about 250,000 new cars are EVs. And in 9 years from now, give or take, we're going to see this number is going to go to 8 million. That's a huge shift. So 250,000 to 8 million in 9 years. I'll let you all do the math to calculate, what the growth rate is every year. But the reason why I think, we're at the cusp of this change is because there are different factors that are helping this. Obviously, we have the policymakers that are helping move this forward. We've got investments in this space. Capital markets are spending a lot of money in mobility and EVs. So, at some point, we'll see the flow to it. And I think the third point is the consumers. Consumers don't know what they're missing out on until they test drive an EV. So consumer interest, it's a sticky effect. The more consumers get into EVs, the more other customers and consumers will want to get in. So I liken this to, the revolution that we had 100 years ago when we went from horse carriages to autos. For me, it's similar. We're going from internally combustion engines to EVs. That shift could take a few more years, but we're at the cusp of it.
Gotcha. Okay, so it sounds like, Alyssa, that Aditya thinks that the test drive is one of the most powerful forces we have out there. What have you seen, or do you expect to make the biggest impact in overall emission reduction across consumer and commercial vehicles?
I do think it's about the consumer experience, but it's also about the policy and how do we as cities or regionally create policies that foster EV ownership and that foster charging. We have a lot of residents that live in multifamily residential, so in apartments and condos, where maybe they don't have access to being able to put in a charger themselves. So how do we as a city create public spaces that not only charge our own fleet, but that can be available for public use for folks that have invested in electric vehicles and just need that charging location near their home?
Gotcha. Alvaro, could you weigh in on that, please? Are you seeing multi-tenant homes get charging resources yet?
Not nearly enough. And it's a difficult thing to try to figure out. From our perspective, new multi-unit buildings are a really good building stock to be able to electrify quickly, both for charging infrastructure and also building electrification to reduce emissions from the building sector. But the sticky point is existing buildings. How do you retrofit existing buildings to be able to absorb charging infrastructure and other forms of electrification? And how do you do this, again, intentionally so that we don't displace tenants of those buildings, so that when the transition happens, the affordability of the building itself, the rental units, don't go so far up that the people that live there now won't be able to live there afterwards. It becomes a really complicated policy discussion. And I do want to emphasize the policy discussion, because alongside with charging infrastructure, which is a policy decision, we also have to think about tenant rights. And we also have to think about just the financing of some of these upgrades, because the existing building owners sometimes don't have the necessary funding to be able to make the upgrade. So it's a very sticky issue, and we don't quite see enough of it yet. But I do want to highlight that one of the things that we are seeing is the deployment of electric car share programs cited at multi-unit dwellings. And I think car share programs for multi-unit dwellings are a really exciting opportunity to introduce electric vehicles, to introduce charging infrastructure, and to do so in a comprehensive plan for what that building's amenities are. So we see this in LA, we see this in Sacramento and other parts of the Bay Area, and we're really excited about this kind of program moving forward, being an option for people to use electric vehicles, but not necessarily own those vehicles themselves.
Great to know. Aditya, today we're discussing what's driving sustainability, and Alvaro just mentioned policy. So other than consumer pressure, I'm wondering what other kinds of push mechanisms are out there encouraging electrification at the consumer level?
So again, if we look at just policy just for a second, policy in my mind is basically two things, right? It is helping create a bridge between now and let's say 2030 to help consumers embrace EVs. Why the bridge? Because let's face it, EVs are pretty expensive. We still don't have total cost of ownership parity between EVs and internal combustion engines. So that's where I think the bridge is important, and hence the policymakers are helping there. That's one. Second, I spoke about this a little earlier. The capital markets. If we look at the amount of money that is being spent in the mobility space, in the EV space, there is a lot of untapped interest that is coming out in terms of what these companies are offering consumers, right? So what you don't know, what you don't know. And that, I think, is being alleviated as we move forward. So I think that, in many ways, is a push mechanism. And the third one, I think this, I would say, is very important. If you look at the market today, the auto market in the US, about 30 to 40% are crossover vehicles, CUVs as we call it. And if you look at all the new EVs coming out, a significant portion of them are CUVs, right? So today, maybe customers buy an EV because it's an EV. But as EVs become more pervasive, customers are going to look at, does this vehicle suit my needs in terms of space, in terms of luggage capacity, cargo capacity, et cetera, et cetera. So if CUVs are the significant portion of new models that are being introduced in the market, and this is what consumers want, I think we're going to see that attraction from customers. So I think these are three important factors that are aiding as push. We spoke about policy, we spoke about products, and we spoke about the capital markets.
Yeah, Alvaro, I want to throw that back to you. What do you see as the relationship between policy and markets, and how can that feed into equity?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to equity, what we see is that the market is not always great at achieving equity. And so that's why then policy becomes a really important tool to be thinking about how to deploy these vehicles in a way that's more equitable for everyone. So I want to mention three important policy decisions that happen in California, or one of them is being worked on. One of them is the Clean Trucks Rule, which requires the sale of trucks in California for certain kind of trucks, for 55% of them to be all electric by 2035. Pickups have to be 75% electric by 2045 too. So that's one market rule that now will make sure that these vehicles are available and are being manufactured for consumer demand to be able to benefit from. The governor also signed an executive order banning the sale of internal combustion engines by 2035. That's another policy decision that will help speed up the market and ensure that we have these vehicles available to everyone. We are also today, actually, there's a hearing on a fleet rule that would also require the purchase of fleets to be 100% electric by 2035. At least that's what we're pushing for, to be able to meet consumer demand in that way. And then the last policy, choice that we are making is this year, California approved a $3.5 billion investment in the deployment of electric vehicles. $400 million of those are going to be specifically towards advancing equity programs that would allow low-income individuals to gain access to these vehicles and deploy different mobility options that meet their needs. So I think the combination of policy and consumer demand is what's going to drive the adoption of the technology. But we have to be, really mindful that the market on its own won't address the inequities that exist currently in our society and in the way that people move around.
Yeah, that's a point well taken. Alyssa, it sounds like some of the policies that Alvaro just mentioned might grease the skids for your work in San Diego. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, and I've worked, the city of San Diego's worked with the Green Lining Institute to get feedback on some of our building electrification work and outreach. And I really agree, as we move forward to match our climate action plan with those state regulations and laws, or even go beyond that, it is then our responsibility to connect back with our underserved communities, to hear from them what they need, educate them about electric vehicles and what the benefits are and what the opportunities are for financing and for charging, where they might see that that's not feasible for them, and showing them how we can support our communities and our residents to make that change to a greener option of mobility where they might choose or need to have a car. And then on the same path or in parallel, we need to support our transit system and furthering our transit system to be efficient and to see that piece of our mobility to also transition to electrification along with our fleet. So it's all working in tandem, but it is our responsibility as a city to work with our communities to make sure that they are supported. And Alvaro said it best, is that we really need to make sure that we don't leave people behind, and we can bring them along and get them the resources that they need and the information they need to make the decisions and move as unison as one.
Yeah, understood. Well, it sounds like Alyssa and Alvaro may have already answered this question, but we're going to go into a quick rapid fire round, starting with Aditya. If you had a magic wand and you could change one policy or consumer behavior, what would it be?
We'd make sure we have enough chargers in the ground right now. Yeah, I think that's extremely important because, I'm not sure if everyone knows, but installing a charger is not like buying a charger for your cell phone. It takes time. It takes effort, there's permitting involved, etc., etc. So having enough chargers will alleviate amongst the top stresses that customers cite when they don't buy EVs. So if we can have these chargers in the ground, I think it will be a big, big win. So I think policymakers are helping with that, but I think this is something that would be great if we had a magic wand.
Gotcha. Maybe that's everyone's answer. Alyssa, what's your answer? What would you do with a magic wand?
That's, I think, a top of my list. I think also having the policies in place that anticipate new mobility technologies and new needs that we have. If I could just wave my wand and have a plan for how to ensure that we have charging, that's a big step in how we can move forward, and the budget's needed and the money to get there. So those public-private partnerships are going to be key. Knowing that, as we come out of COVID and a number of other budget constraints, that we'll have to be creative in our funding solutions. So maybe it's funding solutions.
I can't help but notice these wishes are pretty complex, almost like this problem is also complex. Alvaro, you get the last word. What would you do with a magic wand?
Well, just to continue with the complexity of things, I think what I would do is I would really completely revolutionize the way that we think about transportation, so that we focus more on how we most sustainably and equitably move people versus how we move vehicles. And I think that just the emphasis on thinking about how do we move more vehicles has really never allowed us to reimagine the way that we just think about mobility. So if an option for someone to meet their mobility needs is to be able to have a nicer street to walk on, I would rather have our focus be on that than just on figuring out how do we get everyone who owns a gas vehicle today to tomorrow own an electric vehicle. I don't think that that's the solution that everyone needs. It's a solution, but I think we have to open our minds towards revolutionizing the way that we're thinking about and planning for and executing for our mobility future.
Wow. Well, I have a ton to think about. Thank you so much to our panel. I hope you walk away from today's discussion with a better understanding of what you and your organization can do to drive sustainability in whatever type of transportation you impact.